Hi, Misha here. And one gun of mine that has been on the channel for basically a decade and that gets a lot of attention is my Thompson semi-auto built from an original kit. This is of course in 45 ACP, and this is a model 1928 A1, so the early military style. Cuts compensator, finned barrel, adjustable sights, top cocking, QD stock with the button in the back. Yeah, early style. Also, these could feed from stick mags, 20 rounders originally, or drums. They have the cutout for a drum. Like I said, I've had this one a long time. It was put together for me from a kit by MK Gun Mods, and I've always wanted to give it a companion because while that was the peacetime Thompson, as it were, there was also the wartime M1, and finally one came my way. This is another semi-auto that actually I did using this one as a template, the fire control group. And whereas that previous one was built as a carbine with an extended muzzle device, this one is a pistol, so it can retain the correct 10-inch barrel. And yeah, these were simplified for war production. Simplified sights, no cuts compensator, no ribbed barrel for your pleasure, simplified controls even, and their side charging. And these were meant to feed from only 30 round mags. They were not cut for a drum. So with this build complete, I thought let's revisit the Thompson submachine gun, talk about development, history, and most importantly, variations as we got to the military M1 here. Why not? Again, it's been a very popular gun over the years. Well, before we get started, I would ask you to do please like, share, and subscribe. You know the deal, but it's kind of getting more important than ever, as would any support on Patreon if you can offer it, but if not, no big deal. So why did I want to do parts kits builds? There are semi-autos available, and they're actually pretty reasonably priced. Well, my experiences with them have been less than amazing. About, I guess it was about 2 years ago, we did a video looking at volunteer arms, the command arms, Mark 45, MK 45. It's a Thompson look-alike from way back when. And the clips are interesting. Here's the first attempt at firing. Volunteer, command, whatever Mark 45 thing. Oh, I'm sure it was just a fluke. The mag didn't seat. Let's give it another go. I'm sure that was a mag problem. It's an open bolt. Kind of behind the scenes, the thing was acting really squirrely and a little unnerving. So rather than risk anything, since it was a loaner gun, we just kind of abandoned the thing. Interestingly, anyone who follows my personal channel, Misha, knows that I'm working on having a cabin built at the range area. I've talked a little bit about it here too. Anyway, when we first met the architect out there to do that, he said he had a Thompson he had recently inherited. Well, when he brought it out, of all things, it was one of those command arms Mark 45s. It's kind of funny how those things pop up. Anyway, a couple of years ago when we were doing that, just as a comparison, and just because I actually wanted to hear something go bang, did pull out Jay's Auto-Ordnance, one of the newer Kahar 19 M1927A1 types, often called the Commando, basically a 28 style. And in my experience, they've always run quite well. This thing is so heavy. Okay, that's much better. In the past, I've owned a few different ones, and they have worked. Now, semi-autos have been around since almost the beginning. There was the original Model 1927, although that was pretty short-lived. But then, years later, in 1974, Auto-Ordnance name belonged to basically E-Gun Parts, Numeric, over in West Hurley, New York. They built the M1927A1, which looked like a Thompson, but it was altered to be closed bolt, 16.5-inch barrel, and it wouldn't even feed from standard mags. They actually changed the lower. And those West Hurley guns, I kind of had a mixed reputation with. I didn't have the best experience. They also did the 1927A3, which was a 22 long rifle. And they even did a pistol, the M1927A5. It was interesting because it had a alloy receiver, but it had a 13-inch barrel, not a 10 or whatever, and that was mostly so it was over 26 inches. I've never owned one of those. In 1999, the rights to the Auto-Ordnance name and production of the M1927A1 series transferred to Kahar in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I owned one of their M1 styles, marketed as the TM1, and it ran just as well as Jay's 1927A1 or 1928 style. That model is often called the Deluxe. It has the foregrip and all that. And it feeds from drums. My problem with those, the Thompson is not a light gun. For whatever reason, the West Hurley / Worcester made guns are even heavier. They are machine steel. That's good. Except for, of course, the alloy pistols. But they're striker fired, which means they're a heavier gun, and they are really difficult to charge, either style, top or side cocking. They're just a little uncomfortable, well made, but I thought, yeah, I could do better. And so I sold my M1 years ago and looked to build this, my 1928 A1. And I have had no regrets. I had no problem with the Kahar gun, but I wanted something more authentic and something a little more comfortable to hold, frankly. So nothing against them, certainly no negative like that Command Arms gun, but yeah, you see where I'm coming from. And that's also why these are both hammer fired rather than striker. Make them a little easier to charge. And of course both are in 45 ACP. As to the original, the 1921, 1928, 1928A1s were about 33.5 inches long, with a 12-inch barrel, including the cuts compensator, and they weighed just shy of 11 pounds unloaded. That's not counting a drum. The military M1 M1A1, they were closer to 10.5 pounds, a little over, and they were a little bit shorter, thanks to the lack of a cuts compensator, and about 32 inches overall. And of course, without the drum, that made the magazines and ammunition lighter as well. Now for these, to make this one legal with the stock and the extension, it's about 39 inches. And this one as a pistol is roughly 23 inches, just shy of 2 feet long. Because there's no stock on it, it's under 10 pounds, This one, because of the extension, is right at 11. So it really does feel, this is quite a bit lighter than this. A pound matters. These are big, heavy guns, and they're both built with the original parts as much as possible. So with that, yeah, we'll visit about a history, features, and talk about each of these guns. The title of this video isn't incorrect. I say that this is the first submachine gun. Now, yes, there was the Italian Villa Perosa and its variants, and where Beretta took that, becoming the 1918 there, leading on there. And of course, there was the famous German MP18 built by Bergmann. Both came before the Thompson. But neither were called, marketed, named submachine gun. The term was actually first used by Thompson, by Auto-Ordnance. So this was the first gun of its type to be marketed as a submachine gun, and by that it was firing a pistol caliber cartridge, was select fire or full auto, and, well, it was at least more compact, if not necessarily lighter, than other guns at the time. And it was meant to be a trench broom, a sweeper type gun, a suppression gun. So it really was the first submachine gun as such, certainly generation 1, and would influence scads of later guns in the 1920s and 30s, with its all machined appearance with basically no stamped parts and blued finish, wood furniture, so on and so forth. Now guys, I am not an expert on the Thompson or even American military small arms in general. There are people out there that have an amazing amount of knowledge, but I'll give you the Cliff's Notes version. John Thompson, well, he was the son of a lieutenant colonel, and he wanted to produce something to basically give an individual infantryman a machine gun for World War I. He saw the carnage going on, that a bolt action just really wasn't enough, and wanted to produce something. Now keep in mind, this was before the Browning BAR was a known thing. And in 1916, with backing from Thomas Ryan, he established the Auto-Ordnance Company to develop the principle. Now he had also stumbled across a system by a man named John Blish that basically used friction to try to have a delayed blowback system, or a locked breech type system without being a locked breech. And Thompson negotiated to use the Blish system, and then started experimenting with which of the service cartridges it would work with. Well, 30-06 was ruled out, and basically by 1917 they realized that only 45 ACP, 45 automatic Colt pistol, would work with the Blish system. So that kind of set the path for the gun. Early versions were known as the Persuader or the Annihilator. They had all kinds of prototypes and things and ideas, and it barely missed World War I. In fact, the first prototypes were getting ready to ship over to Europe for field testing when the armistice was declared, November 11, 1918. The BAR was not too much far ahead of it, and missing the war for a few different reasons. The point is, after World War I, after the Great War was over, military interest disappeared. So Thompson kind of redirected for police and defense, law enforcement, security, and eventually the commercial market. The pre-production model would be known as the Model 1919, and about 40 were built. And it had some interesting features, but it really showed the way. A few of them were even purchased by the New York City Police, but, not many were made. And that would actually lead to the model of 1921, built for Auto-Ordnance, because it was a new company, by Colt. And the 1921, that's something to behold. High-grade wood, high-polished blue, nickeled parts including the bolt, and it would ship with either a 20-round mag like this or a 50-round drum. They called the 20-round mag the XX for Roman numeral of 20, or the drum L for Roman numeral for 50. It had the 10.5-inch barrel, but originally no cuts compensator, but it was finned. And originally, of course, it had the vertical forearm we all kind of know and love, similar to this rear grip. It did have a pistol grip. It had a quick detaching stock. It had a Lyman 55B adjustable rear sight, top cocking. Yeah, the 1921 was very nicely made. I mean, it was also very expensive at about $200 in 1920s money. And Colt would produce about 15,000 under contract, and they did not sell particularly well. Now this one has extended cuts compensator style. Here's the original that came with the kit. Notice the grooves are kind of enlarging each time. This was meant to check recoil. The early versions had a pretty high rate of fire, as much as 1500 RPM for some of the prototypes, but even 800 plus for the production model 1921s. And the angle of this stock didn't help. Remember early days. It sweeps down. It fights against you rather than for you. And again, originally they did have the forearm here, so the foregrip, so that helped a little bit. Now, the cuts compensator would come around in 1926 to try to help with recoil, and it was known as the model 1921AC. And the version without the compensator was retroactively known as the model 1921A. And Colt would wrap up its contract. In fact, some of the final ones would actually be converted 1921s, becoming the original model 1927, which was a 1921 with the full auto system disabled. So open bolt, but semi-auto only. These would later be declared NFA items in 1934 because they were virtually the same as the military machine gun. But again, purchasers were very light at this time. It became infamous, the gun that made the 20s roar. The truth is, not many were used in crimes. They were too expensive for your average criminal. But enough high-profile crimes featured the Thompson that a gun originally intended for the military and then to defend civilians in the hands of law enforcement, yeah, it kind of got a negative reputation. But, yeah, there were a few military overseas purchasers. China became quite interested and purchased some in the 20s and 30s to use against Japan and warlords in that country. The U.S. Post Office, the postal inspectors would actually purchase some because there had been a rash of mail robberies, and, well, Thompson is a good way to persuade people not to do that. But, yeah, the first U.S. military order of any note came in 1927 when the U.S. Navy ordered 500 guns. But they needed some changes. Namely, that rate of fire needed to get down. It was hovering around 800 at the time. It needed to get as close to 600 as possible. So what the designers at Auto-Ordnance did, they went to a heavier bolt and Blish system. They're still using it. And they reworked the recoil spring to try to mitigate this. And they were able to get the rate of fire 700, sometimes even 650, sometimes with the right ammo, close to 600 rounds per minute, making them quite satisfied. With the vertical foregrip, this would be the model 1928. And with the horizontal forearm, this would be the model 1928A1. Now this forearm first appeared on the prototype model 1923, which was actually an interesting endeavor, chambering this for 45 Thompson Remington, or Remington Thompson, which was a beefed up cartridge about twice as powerful as 45 ACP. That was to try to deliver more range and accuracy, because some of the early complaints, aside from the thing is damn heavy, they found out that after about 50 yards, 50 meters, it lost accuracy and penetration, because 45, while a large cartridge, large bullet, it's subsonic, so it was dropping off faster than they'd hoped for. So by pumping it up a bit, making it go supersonic, they hoped to do that. The 1923 also featured a bayonet lug and a bipod, of all things. Basically, it was competition for the BAR, but since the military had already adopted the 1918 BAR, they decided not to go forward. The 1923 also kind of introduced the modern sling system, and this is the Care sling, or Care sling, which it took me years to figure out how this thing really works. And there are a few variants we'll look at, but it's kind of a cool sling, but it's also very convoluted. So the Navy contract guns had more of a matte blue finish, and they kind of dropped the nickeling of parts, but they were still high quality. It's also around this time that production would switch from Colt to the Auto-Ordnance factory itself. Soon Savage would step in and start making Thompsons for the military as well. This still has the QD stock, the buttons up top, slides off. Now, it doesn't always slide off, of course my Care sling's in the way, this easily. There's actually a screw, a tensioning screw on the bottom that you would dog down, and that would interface with the notch here, kind of locking it to the gun, because basically the removable stock was meant more for transport, storage, than it was something to be done in the field. Although the idea was, if you needed to, you could use this effectively as a pistol, especially for the 28 with the vertical foregrip. You know, you'd have two grips, but in practice the stock was needed. Personally, again, the angle of the stock and all that. So the Navy contract there, the Navy guns, that was the first big one. The Army, too, would purchase small numbers of the A1 between 1929 and about 1934-35, but we're talking very small numbers to equip a few units here and there. And again, we would have a few foreign customers, but by and large, it was big, it was heavy, and people just weren't really into it. But with that, let's talk about some of the handling and features of this earlier version. So with the 28A1 as a carbine, we still have our QD stock. We have our adjustable rear sight. It's the fancy lineman style that we see on a lot of other military guns at that time. These typically had a high-grade blued finish originally. They've got pretty nice controls, lever style here. Definitely a product for more or less peacetime production, including their drum mags. But originally they were meant for these 20s or the drums. As I said, the drums, they weren't terribly popular with military users. They were heavy, bulky, not especially easy to load in the field. So the 20-round mag was what they mostly went with, but it really wasn't enough capacity, not for a gun with a rate of fire like this. So back here, you notice I've got a pouch. It holds 5 20-round mags, so 100 rounds. I don't actually own a drum. One thing, it's money. For another, they're kind of delicate, kind of fickle. The military's, like I said, didn't really care for them, but it gets worse even as a semi-auto, because this is a closed bolt. With even the military guns, they had to have the bolt cocked back open to load a drum because it rolled in from the side. With a closed bolt version, you have to have what's called a third hand tool. It's just convoluted. The militaries didn't like it. The civilian guns really don't like it. These stick mags are great. They're, of course, double stack, double feed. In fact, this is one of the earliest guns to feature a double stack, double feed mag, which actually contributed to its early success. even having witness holes, although when these would serve in militaries and desert environments, sometimes they would weld up the holes so, well, sand wouldn't get in there. Even had a last round bolt hole open. A feature. And again, it had separate safety and selector and mag catch on the other side. The 1928s and 1928 A1s weren't quite as high quality made as the 1921s, but they were still very much peacetime quality, machined receiver. And by this point we have the cuts compensator, the finned barrel, high grade wood, slings and other equipment were standard. And this would be one of the very few submachine guns on the market throughout the 1930s, although the U.S. Army would not officially adopt it until 1938, even though it was type classified as the model of 1928, being one of the very final U.S. military guns to receive a year model designator, because obviously later they would go to names like M1, M2, etc. But in 1938, it would see full adoption. The Thompson really would change during World War II, and it would become faster and easier to produce, but it still remained a high-quality gun. Like I said, it was adopted by the U.S. Army in 1938 finally, although they dabbled in it a few years. For example, it was used in Nicaragua during the Banana Wars. The Marines used a few. Quite famously, the FBI adopted it in 1933. But foreign military purchase wouldn't really pick up until the war. Yugoslavia and France would both order some, but before their contract could be delivered, they were overrun. Sweden would actually purchase some, adopting it as the model 1940 or M40, and they would keep these in service for over a decade. Britain in 1941 would acquire a relatively large number until the Sten gun was ready. Their current Lanchesters weren't working out as well as they'd hoped. And by 1942, the Soviet Union was acquiring some via Lend-Lease. However, while they had a relatively large number, they didn't use many because of the non-standard 45 ACP cartridge. Got to remember, for the rest of the world, if there was a standard, it was 9x19 Luger Parabellum, or maybe 7.63 Mauser, which is very similar to 7.62 Tokarev, although not identical. The point is, outside of the US, 45 ACP, kind of a weird one. But that's okay, because America would use large numbers. And Auto-Ordnance, and to a lesser extent Savage, would build over 560,000 1928 A1 styles. But they would build over 1,340,000 M1 M1A styles here. And this one very much has its roots in the war. Some of the earliest changes would still happen in the 1928 series. For example, some late versions would do away with the finned barrel and cuts compensator. And they would even go to this simplified L rear sight, still with the 1928. Some would even have more of a paint finish instead of matte bluing. But internally, they were still the Blish system. They were still top cocking, and they could still nominally feed from drums or 20-round mags. One of the first new things developed was this 30-round mag, adopted in December of 1941. Basically just being an extended 20-rounder, kind of the genesis where the so-called jungle mags were 220s were put together, either taped together, welded together. It was cheaper to produce, easier to load in the field, and relatively light. You know, you've got 5 20-rounders in this pouch, so 100 rounds. Well, for less weight and size, you can have 3 30-rounders, 90 rounds in a pouch. And of course, that's equivalent either way to basically 2 drums. all around a better deal. So the 30-round mag just ever so slightly predates the M1 here. The M1 itself, well, the military knew it needed something more economical to produce, and Savage primarily started working on this design, and by February of 1942 the first prototypes were ready. They were tested in March, and they were officially adopted as the M1 in April of 1942. Now, they had all the same shortcuts and expediencies of the late 1928 A1s, but they kept that up. They retained the same rear sight in the beginning. They went to the side charging system. They did away with the ability to use the drums. Simplified controls. They standardized on the, well, simplified barrel and whatnot and what have you. The M1 also did away with the Blish system, as well as the little felt oiler pads, which this semi-auto actually still retains, although they are getting quite old and fuzzy. But they simplified the inside. Now, the M1 still had a floating spring-loaded firing pin, still fired from an open bolt, but without the Blish system, it did save a lot of time in machining, and quickly would go into production at Auto-Ordnance and Savage. So with that, let's take a closer look at this one. It's for manipulating the M1, and for that matter the M1A1. We're going to a side charging system. Of course, in both instances this does reciprocate. We have the simplified fixed rear sight. Of course, there are two different styles for the M1 and M1A1. It's actually a little bit lighter because of the shorter barrel without the cuts compensator and everything. And these could either be military blue or phosphated, Parkerized. They had much simpler controls, simple bars for the safety, and the separate selector switch. Being a semi, these really don't do anything, they're just there for cosmetics. The mag release is virtually the same, but it's bad. The only thing, it's still checkered. This might be one of the few times having it as a quote-unquote pistol might be just as comfortable as the rifle, if I'm being honest with you. I've always found the angle of a Thompson stock to be a little wonky. Plus, this butt plate is just slick, uncheckered, unadorned steel with just only the slightest curve to it. And that's always wanted to slip off my shoulder, especially with the modern auto ordinances, but even with original furniture like this. So back here, 1942 production is really ramping up, and it wouldn't be long, around October, November of that year, another version, the M1A1, was introduced. And while it did streamline production and lower cost slightly, it was mostly introduced to address some problems. For one, for some reason, the M1s, some models with some ammo were having a higher cyclic rate than they were supposed to. Like the 1928 A1, they were around 600, 650 rounds. Some were getting up close to 800 again. So when they went to the M1A1, that kind of solidified it back down to 600-ish. What they did with the M1A1, which isn't really something you can show on a closed bolt semi-auto, they went to a fixed firing pin. So pretty standard submachine gun open bolt style. That simplified things a good bit. They also made some changes and improvements. For one, they went away from this very simple L sight, as you might imagine, even though this is very thick stamping back here. It could be bent. They actually introduced this pattern of sight here. Same fixed style, but it has these very beefy wings or ears to protect it. And one kind of fun thing about this semi-auto build that actually has just regular screws in the back instead of rivets. So you can put whichever sight you want. Late M1s could have the M1A1 style rear sight too, so it's not really an M1A1. You know what I mean. They also would either do these in matte blue, or some would be shipped with a parkerized or phosphate finish. I'm going to pull the pistol away so I can show you the stock that came with this kit, because they also changed it here. They went away from the QD stock with the button on top. It's just a simple fixed stock, no button, held on with 2 screws. They also had introduced this reinforcing bolt here. Now some other versions had it too, but this one does, just to strengthen it up. Not all, but most I've ever had also have this storage compartment in the back for a cleaning kit, because the Thompson had a reputation for reliability, but the caveat was it needed to be kept clean. Units that didn't keep it clean or were not able to reported it wasn't reliable. So it's one of those guns that, kind of like the M16, when kept clean, does well. This has a different pattern of Kerr sling on it too. There's several different things. So it had a simplified fixed stock with the reinforcing bolt, and again the protected rear sight. So the M1 and the M1A1 both would be produced by Auto-Ordnance and Savage, and would kind of be produced concurrently. Even up through 1943-44, you start to see both shipped. And in 1943, the Thompson's replacement was announced, the M3, what we know as the grease gun. And the last order for Thompson's, M1 M1A1s, was placed in February of 1944. And they were delivered through 1945. But even at the end of World War II, there was 1 grease gun for every 3 Thompsons in American service. So it never really did. It's also worth pointing out that when the war was kicked off in 1939, this gun here, the 1928A1, cost the U.S. government $209 with 1 mag and some accessories. By 1942, that cost was all the way down to $70, thanks to the M1 mostly. And by 1944, it was down to $45. That wasn't really because of the M1A1. It wasn't that much cheaper, just slightly. It was mostly just economy of scale and wartime production and, you know, all that. But they were able to really get that cost down a fourth, nearly a fifth. So, but of course, the M3 grease gun would be even cheaper than that, because essentially it was the American Sten. Of course, it had its own problems and issues. Well, the 1920s might have made the Thompson infamous, but the 1940s, World War II, made it famous. America was certainly the largest user. It was originally issued to reconnaissance and armored drivers. Also, the Army Rangers acquired some quite early on, as did paratroopers. It had its purpose, even though it was heavy, even though the .45 cartridge wasn't always the best penetrator in heavy foliage or at ranges past 50 yards. Close in, it could lay down a lot of lead, and as I said, when kept clean, it was quite reliable. There also just wasn't a lot else out there, submachine gun wise. In Europe, it was used quite successfully for street-to-street fighting in places like France. In the Pacific, it was used early on in places like Guadalcanal by the Marines. Although it was better than the Rising, it still had its shortcomings, so by 1943-44, it was being replaced by the 1918 BAR, or even the M1 Grand. But early on, 1942, it served them quite well. It was certainly better than either a bolt action or a relatively fickle gun like the Rising. It was also used by several allies in the Pacific. For example, Australia, who used it until the OWN was ready, New Zealand, India, British forces over there, the Expeditionary Force, so on and so forth. Even Canada used quite a few Thompsons. They were quite well featured in 1941-42 because it was one of the few tested, tried submachine guns available to the Allies until guns like the Sten came online. Of course, even the Russians would take a while to get the PPSH-41 and the PPS-42-43 going as well. The Germans would also capture a few, But again, its cartridge kind of worked against it in German hands, which worked for us. And it certainly made a name for itself, and overall was well liked versus the alternative. The last ones were delivered in 1945. Production would then end. Overall, about 2,700,000 were built. All versions, all variants. So not insignificant. Of course, that's between 1921 and 1945, basically a quarter century. The M1A1 would be the final production version. But because this is a machined receiver and a high quality, very thick, these are very robust guns, either version. They would continue on in military service in the post-war era for quite some time. Famously, they were used during the early days of Israel, first with the Haganah when that turned into the IDF, but also the Arab nations had some Thompsons. In Korea, they were still a standard, and then soon, by 1951, kind of a limited standard as grease guns finally came online enough. But there and again, opposing North Korean and Chinese forces had Thompsons, either ones bought in the 20s or 30s, or Chinese unlicensed clone or copies, so they were on both sides there. The trend would kind of continue in Cuba during the revolution. Fidel Castro, both sides, Batista and Cuba and Fidel would have them. And they would be on both sides during the Bay of Pigs incident in 1961. This both sides thing would kind of continue into Vietnam. By this point, not that many were in frontline American use, although some reconnaissance and kind of spec ops units would use them. Quickly they would be replaced by the Swedish K or the MAC-10 or even the M16. But a lot of South Vietnamese units would have them, and the North Vietnamese were quite partial to the Thompson. And it would continue on. At this time, too, the FBI were still using theirs, although they weren't in frontline use, but they wouldn't actually retire them until 1971, finally ordering them destroyed. And they would appear in Ireland. They had been used in the 1920s some, during independence, and then they would crop up again during the Troubles. The AR-18 Armalite's quite famous, but the Thompson, too, would pop up in the 70s and 80s in North Ireland and all that stuff. And kind of would continue on. Another interesting user, Yugoslavia. In the 50s, the U.S. gave about 34,000 Thompsons to them as foreign aid. And while we don't hear much about them during the Cold War era, in the 1990s, when the nation broke apart into civil war, then they would come out of the closet and be used, still running quite well. I could go on and on. Again, they appeared in several places, and they proved to have very long lives. But that kind of gives you a bit of an idea. In the U.S. military, yeah, by the 70s, they were out of frontline service. But a number of police departments and whatnot would still have them through the 80s, and even maybe some today, although it's more of a curio at that point. And of course, they became quite infamous because of the National Firearms Act and all that stuff, which, as I said at the beginning, is kind of why the whole West Hurley guns were converted as extreme as we saw. And on the U.S. civilian market, there are a large number of registered Thompson machine guns, at least large number compared to other registered guns we have. So that's kind of neat. Their prices have kind of been static for a few years too, so while not cheap, they're one of the more accessible registered guns. But I don't really do machine guns. And as I said at the beginning, I try to be happy with a West Hurley or a Kahar Auto-Ordnance gun. And they're not bad, the Kahars. They really aren't. I'm not dogging on anyone, but I thought we could do one a little better. And luckily I picked up this parts kit long before the prices went nanners. It is a re-welded receiver. These saw-cut receivers were available through IMA for a long time, as were M1 M1A1 styles. And I didn't actually think I was going to get an M1 because the kits went too crazy. Now, we have had some Russian returns in recent years. No more of those probably coming in. And some British returns. But in recent years, the kits have gone nanners. But this one came to me on a trade, and I couldn't say no. Still not a fan of drums, though. With that, let's have some final thoughts, and I have a couple of questions for you. So, hope you enjoyed this kind of look back at technically the first submachine gun, at least the first so-named submachine gun. So I have two questions. First, which design do you like more? The 1928 M1928A1 with all the adornment? Or the simpler, more straightforward M1 M1A1? Keep in mind, no drums for this. This one will feed from drums, but frankly, I kind of like the military. I've never found drums all that useful. So which one do you prefer? Secondly, which method do you like? Retaining the shoulder stock and adding a barrel extension? Now the barrel is still the original barrel, but this is just, pinned and welded on extended cuts. I think I was going to do that. Those mags are really easy to eject, which I guess is a good thing. There's a little guide there, as you know. Stay in there. Do you prefer that style? Or do you like doing them up as a pistol like this? I have to admit, it does kind of balance better than I thought it would because of all the weight. I don't know, which style do you like and which method, pistol or carbine? Now I know you're going to jump in the comments and say SBR. Fair play. But with that out of the question, curious which one you like. Yeah, but I've waited quite a while to find a kit to do one of these with, and figured why not? There hasn't been a whole lot new going on this year, so it seemed like a good time. Plus we haven't had too many American-centric videos lately. So yeah, let me know in the comments. As always, I appreciate you tuning in. As I said at the beginning, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha, and we'll catch you very soon next time.